The most racist countries. What the evidence can and cannot tell us. One of the most provocative questions people ask online is this: what are the most racist countries in the world? It is a powerful question. It is also a dangerous question if we answer it carelessly. Because racism is not one simple thing. It is not measured by one number. It can appear in laws, in institutions, in everyday attitudes, in hiring, in policing, in housing, in marriage patterns, in immigration policy, in media stereotypes, in school systems, and in the way people are treated in public spaces. So, if we want a serious discussion, we cannot simply say, this country is racist, or that country is not racist. That is too shallow. A more responsible question is this: which countries show the strongest evidence of racial, ethnic, caste, or descent-based exclusion, and what kind of evidence are we using? That distinction matters. A country may have a brutal history of legalized racism, but a more racially tolerant population today. Another country may not have had formal racial apartheid, but may have strong social prejudice against minorities, immigrants, darker-skinned people, ethnic outsiders, or lower status groups. Another country may look tolerant in surveys, but still produces major racial inequalities in wealth, housing, policing, and employment. So, this episode is not about creating a cheap ranking. It is about asking what the evidence can tell us, and what it cannot. The first problem: racism is hard to rank. Before naming countries, we need to be honest about measurement. How do you measure racism? One way is through attitude surveys. You can ask people whether they would accept a neighbor of a different race, whether they support interracial marriage, whether they trust ethnic minorities, or whether they hold stereotypes about certain groups. Another way is through reported discrimination. You can ask minorities whether they have experienced discrimination when looking for work, renting a home, dealing with police, entering shops, or using public services. A third way is through historical and legal evidence. Some countries created explicit legal systems that classified people by race and gave different rights to different groups. A fourth way is through institutional outcomes. If one racial or ethnic group is consistently poorer, less educated, more heavily policed, or excluded from housing and employment, that may indicate structural inequality, though we still have to be careful about causation. These measures do not always point to the same countries. For example, the World Values Survey includes questions about whether people would object to neighbors of a different race, which is often used in public discussions about racial tolerance. But that measure captures one attitude, not the entire system of racism. Housing, education, workplace discrimination, or historical oppression. So the first responsible conclusion is this: there is no single scientifically perfect ranking of the most racist countries. What we can do is identify countries or societies where the evidence of racial or identity-based hierarchy is especially deep, historically documented, or currently measurable. For this discussion, we will examine 3 evidence-rich cases. South Africa, because apartheid remains one of the clearest examples of legally enforced racial hierarchy. The United States, because of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, and continuing disparities, is one of the most documented cases of institutional racism. And India, because caste, colorism, descent-based discrimination, anti-Dalit exclusion, and ethnic religious hierarchy raise an important question. Should racism be limited only to Western racial categories, or should descent-based discrimination also be part of the discussion? We will also briefly discuss Europe, especially because recent data on Black people's experiences in the European Union complicates any simplistic ranking. Case Study 1. South Africa. If you are asking where racism was most clearly built into the legal structure of a modern state, South Africa is one of the strongest cases. Apartheid, which means apartness, was the formal system of racial separation in South Africa from 1948 until 1994. It was not merely prejudice, it was law. It classified people, separated communities, restricted movement, controlled marriage, regulated residence, and structured political and economic power by race. The Population Registration Act of 1950 required South Africans to be assigned to racial categories, and this racial classification became the foundation of apartheid law. Historical artifacts from apartheid are especially powerful because they show racism as bureaucracy. The artifacts include racial identity documents, passbooks, whites-only signs, segregated public facilities, forced removal notices, maps of townships and homelands, and laws banning interracial marriage or sexual relationships across racial lines. The National Archives notes that South Africa's Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949 prevented marriage between people of different races. This matters because apartheid was not simply a matter of private attitudes. It was a state-designed racial order. The logic was clear. White South Africans were given political power, property rights, mobility, and economic privilege. Black South Africans were restricted, displaced, and forced into subordinate social and economic positions. Indian and colored South Africans were also classified and treated differently under the racial system. The evidence here is not subtle. It is legal, administrative, spatial, and economic. If we are ranking countries by historical legal racism, South Africa belongs near the top of any serious discussion. But here is where we must be careful. Modern South Africa is not apartheid South Africa. The apartheid regime ended. South Africa now has a constitutional democracy and one of the world's most famous anti-apartheid legacies. But the effects of apartheid did not disappear when the laws changed. Residential segregation, wealth inequality, land ownership patterns, education gaps, and labor market inequalities can survive long after legal apartheid ends. This is one of the most important lessons about racism. Racist laws can be repealed quickly. Racist structures can last for generations. So, the South African case teaches us that racism is not only about individual hatred. It can be engineered into land, housing, schools, jobs, citizenship, and movement. Case Study 2. The United States. The United States is another major case, not because it is uniquely racist in every possible measure, but because its racial history is unusually well documented and deeply institutional. The United States had slavery. Then, after slavery came Reconstruction. Then came Jim Crow segregation. Then came housing discrimination, school segregation, voting suppression, anti-miscegenation laws, immigration exclusion, redlining, and racial disparities in criminal justice, wealth, education, and health. The Library of Congress explains that by the end of the 19th century, laws or informal practices requiring African Americans to be segregated from whites were commonly called Jim Crow practices. PBS describes Jim Crow as a formal system that dominated the American South for about 3/4 of a century, affecting schools, parks, libraries, drinking fountains, restrooms, buses, trains, and restaurants. The historical artifacts are also extremely clear. There were colored and white signs. There were segregated schools. There were poll taxes and literacy tests. There were restrictive covenants. There were anti-miscegenation laws. There were maps used to grade neighborhoods for lending risk, a practice widely associated with redlining. The Mapping Inequality Project describes redlining as the practice of categorically denying mortgage access not just to individuals, but to entire neighborhoods. It documents homeowners' loan corporation maps created between 1935 and 1940. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition describes redlining as denying borrowers access to credit based on the location of properties in minority or disadvantaged neighborhoods, and notes that while overt redlining became illegal under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, its effects remain visible in U.S. cities. This is why the United States is such an important case. It shows how racism can move from slavery to law, from law to housing, from housing to wealth, from wealth to school quality.